All right, this is the second part of the what will I call it? Dismantling the myth, basically, of that like bagpipes were banned by law in Scotland and Ireland. This is a really, really, really common and false notion that's just all the time. It's spread all over the internet. Every time you look it up, bagpipes, like you will invariably read somewhere that like whether you're talking about Ireland or Scotland, that like bagpipes were banned, and it's all about like the crown forces and the government and all this banned bagpipes in Ireland and Scotland, and that's how like they became like seen as the rebel instrument and the instrument of war, and they were bagpipes themselves became classified as actual instruments of war and weapons in themselves, and it's just not true like that. It's just not. This is just right. There's elements of it being true, but we need to look at the sources, right? We actually need to go back and look at the original sources, the original acts, so-called like acts of prescription and disarmament acts and everything else, to actually look and see what it says. And in Ireland's case, it always goes back to like the statutes of Kilkenny from 1367. Now, I've done the whole one on the statutes of Kenny from 1367. It's surprising me I actually was able to go on about it for about a whole hour, pulling it apart. And in no part of that, say in that one for argument's sake, in 1367, in the Irish case, the statutes of Kilkenny, in no part of that does it actually put a blanket ban on bagpipes. It just doesn't. It's just simply not true. And it's the same with these Scottish ones as well. Like, right, we're going to talk about here. The original sources are like the Disarmament Act of 1715, after the 1715 rebellion, and it came into effect in 1716. Then there was that was revised in 1725, the new Act of Disarming the Highlands. And then again in 1746, after the last uprising, Jacobite uprising, there was the Act of Prescription and also the Dress Act. None of these specifically ban bagpipes. There's no. I'm gonna go through the acts with you right now. Don't think this is just boring old shite. Like it's grey and it's drab and humdrum and boring acts of this, that, and the other. I've done all of that for you. I've looked through them. I've read through them. I've spent hours at this, and I've narrowed it down to the part that I'll read out the actual sentences that people say is, oh yeah, well this is how it means that bagpipes are banned. It doesn't specifically ban bagpipes. None of these things do. What people always quote then is what happened to Piper James Reid. That his sentence basically was that like he was sentenced to death because he basically played a bagpipe, and then because he was unarmed apparently when he was caught or whatever, and his only thing that he was holding, like he was fighting with the Jacobites, and the only thing that he had in his possession was his bagpipe. So therefore, because he was sentenced to death over this, his instrument was like declared an instrument of war. Therefore, it's a weapon. That isn't the case. He was sentenced to death for treason. He was sentenced to death like for being like on the wrong side of the civil war. Like he'd have been sentenced to death anyway. It's it's not because his bagpipes was a weapon. That actually wasn't the decision. Um, like the famous quote was like basically, he was executed for carrying a set of bagpipes. That the judge was supposed to have said a Highland regiment never marched without a piper at its head. Well, neither did the Highland regiments or the other Scottish regiments who fought on the crown side, they also had pipers at their heads. So that's the whole thing of this. It's like, it's just basically if you were on the wrong, in inverted commas, because I know that a lot of you listening to this like think that if you had been alive back then, you would have supported King Charles, the Bonnie Prince. Maybe you would have, maybe you wouldn't have. I don't know. I think we all sort of tend to like look really kind of romantically at these kind of times, and sort of, it's always like the rebel idea always seems to be the most appealing one, but and it's that sort of thing is always romanticized, always in books and nowadays in films and documentaries and everything, TV series. It's like we always go for the underdog, and we always sort of feel sorry for the defeated person, and always imagine what might have been. I totally get it. I understand it. It's understandable, and I've done it myself, like for Irish and Scottish history. But I think, let's face it, like the reality of life, no matter what century you're in, is the first thing you're going to do is look after your own family. If you have kids, or your wife and your parents and your own close relations, you put them first. And that's what people did back in the day. And sometimes it suited them to, the ones that were successful or whatever made it, like, always chose like right the winning side or whatever. So I'm not going to I'm trying not to get too much into the politics of like whether whether the Jacobites were right, or the Crown forces under the Hanoverians were right. I'm not going to get into that argument, because it's a whole other topic. We're talking about bagpipes here, and I just think that generally this whole thing is romanticized like just way too much, and it's not practical, and it's not even reasonable. As I say, you would have done what was best for your own family. So whichever side you thought was probably going to be the most successful, or wherever you're going to gain most out of, that's the side you're probably most likely going to go with. Else it's just suicide. You're forcing suicide, and you're forcing a death on your own family, not just yourself. Like so these conflicts are like, I'm just not gonna try and take sides in this, because these are civil wars as well, and they were always going on since the dawn of time in both Scotland and Ireland. They were always killing each other. Never mind whether the English were even there or not. Like the whole thing in Ireland and in Scotland was that our countries were never ever really united ever under this sort of imagined system of this kind of Gaelic world of kings and sort of high kings and chiefs and all that sort of stuff. They just did nothing but kill each other since the dawn of time. They never saw themselves as a unit, as a unified thing at all, and they always tended to make alliances and allegiances, and it's all skullduggery, and it's all planning against like enemies and getting one up on the others. And they used the English in their battles, like just like the English used them. And this is the whole problem with all of this. The whole point of all of this is basically just, I'm gonna use bad language, but the whole point of all of this is always like, fuck the English. That's the whole point of all of this. And it's just not true. It's like, blame the fucking English on everything that happens and goes wrong, and it's a way of releasing ourselves, or our forebears, of responsibility, just to fucking blame them on everything, including like the destruction of everything that was Gaelic or whatever, like whether it's like the language or the dress or whatever sort of way of life. And the bagpipes is used as another example of how they basically, like English, like fucked us over and like stopped us from playing the bagpipes. But this is why I'm trying to get to the bottom of this myth, because it just simply isn't true. There was nothing to stop you playing. Bagpipes, as long as you weren't actually playing them in the army of like Bonnie Prince Charlie, like as a rebel or as an out and out Jacobite. That's it. Like everything that was associated with Jacobites was sort of stopped or banned or restrictions put on it, because it was political. It's not that the bagpipes were banned across the whole country. Sure, that's total nonsense. The bagpipe survived in Scotland. Like, it survived as an instrument, like, down to this day. You just weren't allowed to do it as a Jacobite. That's all. There was nothing to stop you playing at a wedding or something like that, or at a funeral, or people always forget about the Lowland Pipes as well. Lowland Pipes always get left out. That as if, as if it's like didn't exist. I would argue that actually most bagpiping that was done up and down the length and breadth of Scotland was played on smaller pipes, like Lowland pipes. And there's lots of sketches and stuff like that to attest to that like piping just did carry on. And the great bagpipes did carry on in the British Army, except, of course, it was the king that won, obviously, was like, German Geordie or whatever you want to call him. But they continued to play the bagpipes. The regiments like continued in the service of the crown to play bagpipes. So the only time that it's ever sort of stopped or banned or whatever, like in the case of Piper James Reid, is when you're actually caught piping like in an open act of defiance. It was the same with the statutes of Kilkenny. There was no, in Ireland, like centuries earlier, there was no blanket ban on bagpiping either. It was only if you were caught on the wrong side of a conflict and you were caught with your bagpipes. But you'd have been caught anyway, because if you were on the wrong side of the conflict and you got caught, it didn't matter whether you had a sword or a musket or a bagpipe or a dagger or a flag, or like I used this analogy before. I thought it was quite good, so I was kind of giving myself a pat on the back for it. Right, it's scissors, right? Say today, like, we have the scissors, right? So you can, like, probably, you most likely use the scissors at work. If you work in an office, you'll need the scissors. When you're at home, there's the scissors. Whatever, you might have a sort of a pocket, sort of Swiss Army knife kind of thing. There's going to be a scissors on it, whatever, like that, right? The scissors isn't a weapon. It's not an instrument of war or whatever like that. But obviously, if you go into work and you pick up that same scissors and you stick it into your boss's stomach, well, then it is a weapon. Then, if you stab your husband or you stab your wife with the scissors, yeah, it's a weapon. But that doesn't mean that there's going to be an out and out blanket ban on scissors. It just scissors is that even a real word? But it just means that the scissors caught in the wrong hand gets the person the conviction of the crime. It's not that necessarily using the scissors is a bad thing or it's a banned thing, and that's the same thing what happens with these bagpipe myths. It was the same in Ireland. I pulled apart the whole thing of the statutes of Kilkenny. These videos are going to be, the one I done about Kilkenny, I think it goes on for about an hour, right? Because I'm looking at the whole historical, cultural context of when that ban was set. So I can see this one being about the same length, about an hour. But I'm going to just do small ones as well, just really just boiling it down and getting narrow in straight to the point of just reading out the law and then sort of saying, look, that's not what it means. So what we just need to do here is we need to actually get back to the original source. And I've done that for you. If you stick with this, I'm going to read out the laws and I'm going to prove to you that nowhere does it say bagpipes are banned in Scotland. It doesn't even mention a bagpipe. The closest we get to that, as I say, is the story of Piper James Reid, which I'm going to deal with individually. But it's not because he was a bagpiper, it's because he was caught with all the Jacobites. If he had been playing his bagpipe on the opposite side, he would have been grand. That's the whole point of it. Okay, so here goes. Now let's get stuck into this act. Right, so we're starting off we're actually going back to the first year of King George's reign, which was 1714. Now, there's just a little sort of caveat here about that year, okay? The act is always sort of stated as coming into effect in 1716, that it was sort of initiated in 1715 and came into effect in 1716. And yet I'm after saying now that we're starting in the first year of his reign, which was 1714, okay? Now the reason is, there's a good reason behind this. You'll find when you're looking through the older stuff from the 1700s. the see the calendar changed basically. The the old Julian calendar was still in use throughout George's life, and that was actually a year and a bit behind the Gregorian calendar. So that's the don't get too worried about this 1 year and the difference thing, because what was happening was um in 1700 King George adapted the new calendar, right, which kind of put the official year ahead by a year. But loads of people in the kingdom still didn't use it. They were still using the older calendar. So sometimes there's this discrepancy of a year. So you often do find it even on old headstones, gravestones, and something like that. You'll see something like he died 1715 or 1716 or something. You will see sometimes that they mention both years, right? So don't get too hung up on the year. Okay, it's just 1 year out, but that's not really the point. The point is, let's see what it says, and let's see, does it mention bagpipes, right? So here goes. So what I'm reading is the actual document of the Act of Prescription. I have it entitled here, the Act of Prescription 1746/1747. Right, there's that year thing. And what it does is it actually mentions, it spells out the first disarming act of 1715/1716. Then it tells you about the new act, which was revived in 1725, which became expired. And then this final one, in its own words, from the 1st of August 1746, reinforces the first two. Right, so it doesn't actually really it doesn't change the text. The text is pretty much the same. So I'll just read you exactly what it says, and just listen out for the bit for bagpipes, because it's not there. Okay, here goes. So we quote: "Whereas by an act made in the first year of the reign of His late Majesty King George the First, of glorious memory, intituled an act for the more effectual securing the peace of the Highlands in Scotland. It was enacted that from and after the first day of November, which was in the year of our Lord 1716, it should not be lawful for any person or persons, except such persons as are therein mentioned and described, within the shire of Dunbarton on the north side of the water of Leven, Stirling on the north side of the river of Forth, Perth, Kincardine, Aberdeen, Inverness, Nairn, Cromarty, Argyll, Forfar, Banff, Sutherland, Caithness, Elgin and Ross, to have in his or their custody, use or bear broadsword or target, poniard, whinger or dirk, side pistol, gun, or any other warlike weapon, otherwise than in the said act was directed under certain penalties adopted by the said act." Okay, so let's just have a second look at that, right? What that's doing, I'm not going to start naming all those places again, right? It's saying basically it tells you from what areas like that this act is enforced. So it's generally kind of considered like the Highlands, to disarm the Highlands, right? So it names all the people, or all the areas, okay? And the actual words are to have in his or their custody, use or bear, a broadsword or target, a poniard, whinger or dirk. Now they're types of knives, right? A whinger and a poniard are types of kind of daggers, weapons. They're blades. Or a dirk. A dirk is a weapon, like it's a dagger weapon, right? So, yeah, they're types of dagger. A poniard and So I'll just look up the definition, right, of poignard for you. Here it is. A poignard is a long, lightweight, thrusting knife with a continuously tapering, acutely pointed blade and crossguard, historically worn by the upper class noblemen or knighthood. And the whinger is a wood knife or a hunting sword, is a long knife or a short sword that hangs from the belt and was popular as both a hunting tool and a weapon of war. And a dirk, we know that if you know anything about Highland dress, like a dirk is a long knife, it's a long dagger that you wear on your belt. I suppose I have to think about people who don't, who might not be familiar with this stuff. The other things there are, right, a broadsword that speaks for itself, and a target is the shield. It's the rounded, leather covered, studded shield with like brass tacks. So that's it, right? So the things that are mentioned in this, which date from that year, 1716, is: it's not lawful for any person to have in his or their custody, to use or to bear, in other words to hold, a broadsword or a target, a poignard, a whinger or dirk, a side pistol, gun, or other warlike weapon. No mention of musical instruments. No mention of a bagpipe. They're actual weapons. Actual weapons. And so there's absolutely zero evidence that it's mentioning any kind of a musical instrument. And for those that still want to believe that, they're still going to keep throwing that, well, Piper James Reid was hung because he was a bagpiper. And because the judge said a Highland regiment never marched without a piper at its head. That's not saying that the bagpipes was an instrument of war. It's not actually calling the bagpipe a weapon. And anyway, this was the law back in 1716. This didn't happen. James Reid did not happen until 1746. And again, it's just because he was caught, like he was caught like fighting with the Jacobites. He was caught in the middle of it all. Like, it's not because he was just executed. He was just this randomer that they just pulled out of absolutely nowhere that just happened to be playing a bagpipe one day. He was playing his pipes with the Jacobites, which was that was the act of treason. And yeah, so what if the judge said, well, he said, no Highland army, what is this, the supposed quote say? Here's the quote: a Highland regiment never marched without a piper at its head. But sure, that's any Highland regiment. Like the Crown Forces used pipers at their heads as well. So the instrument was not banned as an instrument of war. It's just that Piper James Reid was caught, as it keeps saying, on the opposite side of it. So he'd have been killed anyway. That is, it was enough to just say, yeah, do you know what? Well, he was part of it, so execute him. They never said bagpipes. They never specifically came out and said in black and white anywhere that bagpipes are an instrument of war. It doesn't say anywhere that it says that they're the instrument of war in those laws. So I've just read that. I've just read, right, the Act one last time back in 1716. In the year of our Lord 1716, it should not be lawful for any person or person, and then it names the areas, to have in his or her custody, use, or bear a broadsword or a target, poignard, whinger, or dirk, side pistol, gun, or other warlike weapon. Now I'll read on through the act, because this is when it sort of says that basically that this act wasn't sufficient enough to basically to work, and then how it sort of in the 11th year, like of the king's reign, which was like 1725, it had been reinstated again, and then it had expired by 1732. So they wanted to just reenact it. So I'll just read that little bit. Like, now it doesn't mention weapons or anything like that, but it's just saying about how they kind of like reinforced it, or after it had expired, how they brought it out again. Okay, I'll just read on. Okay. Um. Right, so I'll just do it once more for you, like just to really drive it home, right? Really, really drive it home. To have in his or their custody, use, or bear a broadsword or a target, a poniard, a whinger or dirk, a side pistol, gun, or other warlike weapon, otherwise than in the said act was directed, under certain penalties appointed by the said act, which act having by experience been found not sufficient to attain the ends therein proposed, was further enforced by an act made in the 11th year of the reign of his late Majesty, entitled, or in other words entitled, an act for the more effectual disarming the Highlands in that part of Great Britain called Scotland, and for the better securing the peace and quiet of that part of the kingdom, and whereas the said act of the 11th year of his late Majesty being, so far as it related to the disarming of the Highlands, to continue in force only during the term of 7 years. Right, so just what they're saying there is that in the 11th year of the king's reign was 1725, and then it was in force for the next 7 years, which brought it up to like 1732, which had then expired. So what they're doing here is they're reviving that act again, or they're reinstating the same act. The same act that mentions the above weapons, they're not adding to it. They're just bringing it back in. So I'll just read it. Yeah. Whereas the said act of the 11th year of his late Majesty being, so far as it related to the disarming of the Highlands, to continue in force only during the term of 7 years, and from thence to the end of the next session of Parliament, is now expired. And whereas many persons within the said bounds and shires still continue possessed of great quantities of arms, and there with a number of such persons have lately raised and carried on a most audacious and wicked rebellion against his Majesty in favour of a popish pretender, and in prosecution thereof did, in a traitorous and hostile manner, march into the southern parts of this kingdom, took possession of several towns, raised contributions upon the country, and committed many other disorders, to the terror and great loss of his Majesty's faithful subjects, until by the blessing of God on his Majesty's arms they were subdued. Now, for preventing rebellion and traitorous attempts in time to come, and the other mischiefs arising from the possession or use of arms by lawless, wicked, and disaffected persons inhabiting within the said several shires and bounds, be it enacted by the King's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, that from and after the first day of August 1746, it shall be lawful for the respective Lord Lieutenants of the several shires above recited, and for such other persons as his Majesty, his heirs or successors shall, or by his or their sign manual, from time to time, think fit to authorise and appoint in that behalf, to issue or cause to be issued out letters of summons in his Majesty's name, and under his or their respective hands and seals, direct to such persons within the said several shires and bounds, as he or they from time to time shall think fit, thereby commanding and requiring all and every person and persons therein named, or inhabiting within the particular limits therein described, to bring in and deliver up at a certain day in such summons to be prefixed, and at a certain place therein to be mentioned, all and singular, his and their arms and warlike weapons unto such Lord Lieutenant or other person or persons appointed by his Majesty, his heirs of successors in that behalf as aforesaid, for the use of his Majesty, his heirs or successors, and to be disposed of in such manner as his Majesty, the heirs or successors shall appoint. So all of that just sort of said basically that everyone has to stop bearing arms against the king, and that they've to hand up the weapons. Just from that little bit there about that from and after the first day of August 1746, there's going to be letters of summons in His Majesty's name, and that basically the people must, I quote, to bring in and deliver up at a certain day in such summons to be prefixed, and at a certain place therein to be mentioned, all and singular, his and their arms and warlike weapons unto such Lord Lieutenant or other persons appointed by His Majesty. So it's just saying basically they have to hand over in the weapons, like actual weapons. There's not one mention there of a bagpipe. So that's it. That's it in its entirety. That's the disarming acts. We've taken it from the year like 1715 up to 1746. Okay, so now I can hear some people screaming. It came under the Dress Act then, the Dress Act of 1746, because bagpipes are a part of Highland dress, right? Right, so like as if everyone who wears Highland dress has to play a bagpipe or has to walk around carrying a set of bagpipes because they're part of the national costume. Is that what they're trying to say? I don't know. Well, let's have a look at the Dress Act. Let's just have a look at what it says in the Dress Act. And I have a fantastic article here which really sums everything up and quotes the Act and everything else. So, like, here goes, right? So, the Dress Act. Just a little introduction, I'll just read this. Perhaps the most widely and frequently repeated so-called fact surrounding the early history of tartan is that its use was banned by the 1746 Act of Prescription following the defeat of the Jacobites at the Battle of Culloden in April earlier that year. The Act has also been credited with banning the playing of bagpipes, speaking Gaelic, and gathering family members together in public. In fact, the Act banned none of these. This paper will confine itself to a review of evidence for and against the claim that the Act banned the wearing of tartan. So here we go. Here's the Act, right? So just a little bit to retouch up on what we were doing there with the Act of Prescription 1716, 1725. Right, the post-Culloden legislation followed the earlier and ineffectual 1716 Act, which said, don't forget, in his or their custody, use or bear broadsword or target, poniard, whinger or dirk, side pistol, gun, or other warlike weapon, unless authorised, right? That's 1716. 1725, same thing, only revived again, and it said, an act for the more effectual disarming the highlands of Scotland and for the more effectual securing the peace of the said highlands. Okay, that's 1725. So the post-Culloden legislation follows the earlier and ineffectual 1716 and 1725 acts and was an act for the more effectual disarming the highlands of Scotland and for the more effectual securing the peace of the said highlands and for restraining the use of highland dress. Essentially, the third act was a revision of the earlier 1725 one, but with an extra section added to ban what the government considered to be a martial dress that was central to the Jacobite identity. This relevant act section, the relevant section of the act stated that. Now this is really important. This is the Highland dress one. This is about the clothes, right? And again, you'll find there's nothing to do with bagpipes in this. Okay, here goes. Quote, that from and after the first day of August 1747, no man or boy within the part of Great Britain called Scotland, other than such as should be employed as officers and soldiers in His Majesty's forces, should, on any pretence whatsoever, wear or put on the clothes commonly called Highland clothes, that is to say, the plaid, philibeg or little kilt, trews, shoulder belts, or any part whatsoever of what peculiarly belongs to the Highland garb, and that no tartan or partly coloured plaid or stuff should be used for great coats or for upper coats, under the penalties therein mentioned, and the time appointed for laying aside the said Highland dress was, in certain cases therein mentioned, further prolonged by several acts, one made in the 20th and the other in the 21st year of the reign of his said late Majesty King George II. And whereas it is judged expedient that so much of the acts above mentioned as restrains the use of Highland dress should be repealed, be it therefore enacted by the King's most excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same, that so much of the acts above mentioned or any other act or acts of Parliament as restrains the use of the Highland dress be, and the fame are hereby repealed. So that was the repeal of the act. So the act. So let's just have a little look at that act again, right? I don't even know why I'm bothering doing it, because it clearly doesn't mention bagpipes. So anyone that tells you that is like, they're full of bullshit, right? So let's just see what it says, and we pull that apart, because it doesn't even ban tartan. You think it's actually banning tartan, and it's banning the kilt and all of that, but it's only in certain circumstances, and certain people are exempt from it, like officers and soldiers of His Majesty's forces. And women, it's not banned for women either. It's only men and boys. So, look, I'm not saying I agree with it or anything. I'm not trying to defend this act. I think it's dreadful, to be honest with you. But I don't. It should never be used as that backup. That it's always used as the one that sort of says, yeah, well, bagpipes are part of Highland dress. Like, they're not. Like, the bagpipes is an instrument. Like, it's not an item of clothing. Let's just read this again, just slowly, and I'll just pull it apart, right? I won't do the boring bit, just the bit that matters, right? That from and after the first day of August 1747, so 1747, no man or boy, within that part of Great Britain called Scotland, doesn't mention women, just men and boys, within that part of Britain called Scotland, other than such as should be employed as officers and soldiers in His Majesty's forces. So other than soldiers and officers, so they're allowed still to do it, should on any pretence whatsoever wear or put on the clothes commonly called Highland clothes, that is to say, the plaid, philibeg or little kilt, which even proves that in 1746 there was a little kilt, because some people tried to tell you that the little kilt was a later invention. So it was in use in 47. Now, so it says the plaid, the philibeg or little kilt, trews, shoulder belts, or any part whatsoever of that peculiarly belongs to the Highland garb, and that no tartan or partly coloured plaid or stuff should be used for great coats or upper coats, And that's it. So 0 again about bagpipes. And I think this article makes a very few good, interesting points here. It says, the highlighted section has been taken by some as evidence that the Act banned tartan, like as if it banned tartan altogether. However, a reading of the full text gives a completely different meaning. It says that no tartan or partly colour plaid or stuff should be used for great coats or upper coats. It's just talking about making coats out of it. Read in the context of the whole paragraph, it is quite clear that this section is the end of a list of Highland clothes, and there is no mention of tartan cloth being banned. The sharp-eyed reader will also have spotted that the Act applies to no man or boy. Women therefore could continue to wear tartan clothes. So it's actually making a distinction here between Highland clothes and not tartan itself. So it's the style of the Highland clothes themselves, and it's not the actual cloth, which is good to think about. I'll just read on here. Not only were soldiers explicitly exempt from the Dress Act, but women were implicitly excluded too. Elsewhere in the Act, landed men and the sons of landed men were exempted, which accounts for the number of portraits showing men and boys of both Jacobite and Hanoverian persuasions wearing Highland dress, rather than the law being ignored by the gentry. The Act was repealed in 1782. The accompanying proclamation reinforces the point that the original Act forbade the wearing of Highland clothes and not tartan. So this is what that says. Listen to this. This is for the repeal of the Act. Listen, men, this is bringing before all the sons of the Gael, the King and Parliament of Britain, have forever abolished the Act against the Highland dress, which came down to the clans from the beginning of the world to the year 1746. This must bring great joy to every Highland heart. You are no longer bound down to the unmanly dress of the Lowlander. This is declaring to every man, young and old, simple and gentle, that they may after this put on and wear the trews, the little kilt, the coat, and the striped hose, as also the belted plaid, without fear of the law in the realm or despite of the enemies. And this is rather interesting as well. It sort of says that it was really difficult to enforce the Act, and a lot of the times it was just ignored. Anyway, the Act proved difficult to enforce in the remote Highlands, and the period of grace proved inadequate and had to be extended, except for landowners and their sons. So they could just carry on, as it appears. So it had to be extended initially to the 1st of August in 1748, and then on to Christmas of 1748 for the plaid and the kilt, and on to the 1st of August of 1749 for the other prescribed clothing. John Mackay of Ross Hall in Strathnaver was one of those that ignored the Act. In 1751 he appeared before the Sheriff of Inverness wearing the Highland clothes. Note, it was not for wearing tartan, it was for wearing Highland clothes. There is no indication of what clothes he was wearing, but in accordance with the Act he was convicted and imprisoned for 6 months. The fact that the prescription applied to Highland clothes and not tartan is confirmed in a letter on the 22nd of November of 1748, when James Erskine, Sheriff Deputy of Perthshire, wrote to Colin Campbell of Glenure with guidance on enforcing the Act. And I quote, "The Act prohibiting the use of the plaid and fillibeg should be proclaimed at the church door in Erse." Right, Erse is Irish or Gaelic. You may take all the opportunities you can of letting it be known that tartan may still be worn in cloaks, waistcoats, breeches or trews, but that if they use loose plaids, they may be of tartan, but either all of one colour or striped with other colours than those formerly used, and if they have a mind to use their old plaids, I don't see but they make them into the shape of a cloak, and so wear them in that way, which though buttoned or tied about the neck, if long enough, may be taken up at one side and thrown over their other shoulder, by which it will answer most of the purposes of the loose plaid. And if they could come into the way of wearing wide trousers like the sailor's breeches, it would answer all the conveniences of the kilt and filibeg for walking and climbing the hills. So I'll just read that again quickly because it got stuck. It says the act prohibiting the use of the plaid and filibeg should be proclaimed right on the church doors in Erse. You may take all the opportunities you can of letting it be known that tartan may still be worn in cloaks, waistcoats, breeches, or trills, but that if they use loose plaids, they may be of tartan, but either all of one colour or striped with other colours than those formerly used. And if they have a mind to use their old plaids, I don't see but they make them into the shape of a cloak, and so wear them in that way, which though buttoned or tied about the neck, if long enough, may be taken up at one side and thrown over the other shoulder, by which it will answer most of the purposes of the loose plaid. And then it says if they come into the way of wearing wide trousers like the sailor's breeches, it would answer all the conveniences of the kilt and filibeg for walking and climbing the hills. So look, that's the dress act, and again, just bagpipes just aren't mentioned. That's just about clothes, and even at that, it's not even. It just says Highland. Like, what does it say? Yeah, like the wearing of Highland clothes. It's not actually the wearing of tartan. It doesn't specifically say tartan is banned. Again, it's just it's banned in if you're wearing it and in the form of Highland clothes. Now, look, I know I'm nitpicking there, but um, all it says though that yeah about no tartan or partly coloured plaid or stuff should be used for grey coats and upper coats. That's all. But then yeah, it says that you shouldn't wear a filibeg or a little kilt, trousers or shoulder belts. That's the style of the Highland clothes. So it's banning Highland clothes per se, and not actually definitively banning tartan. And soldiers and officers are exempt. What is it? Yeah, officers and soldiers. They're fine. Women are fine, and the the gentry. So I think a good way to sum up that dress act, again, nothing got to do with bagpipes at all. Nothing got to do with musical instruments, or songs, or anything else. It's a good conclusion. It says the banning of Tartan following the defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden is one of a number of myths surrounding tartan and Highland dress for which there is absolutely no proof. In this case, examination of the source material identified the section of the Act that has and continues to be misconstrued. Whilst some zealous enforcers of the Act may have regarded tartan and Highland clothes as one and the same, the facts speak for themselves, and it is clear that it was not the original intention of the Act should ban the cloth itself, and this was never officially applied. However, because the Highlander was forced into lowland dress his everyday link with tartan was irrevocably severed, which resulted in a later perception that tartan itself was banned. Whilst tartan was not banned per se, the suppression of Highland dress meant that in many cases the traditional link between the Highlander and tartan was broken, and that by the time that the Dress Act was repealed in 1782, the harsh economic realities of the previous 35 years in much of the Highlands meant that traditional weaving techniques and knowledge had fallen into disuse. Okay, so now finally, right, we're going to get on to Piper James Reid. And again, this example of Reid and his execution is often cited as being the one of the main sort of things was that bagpipes are an instrument of war and therefore they were banned as such, right? Now, even if in this one case of James Reid, if it's actually stated that his bagpipes were an instrument of war, um, it's what people who support this myth that bagpipes were banned and were prescribed is that they look at this case and join it up with the Disarming Act and the Act of Prescriptions as if the bagpipe itself was a weapon. So I would argue, just before we even look at this, right, which I'm going to break it down as well, an instrument of war, that's the play is on the word instrument. So you see, is it a weapon? I mean, it's mentioned here as well that drums are an instrument of war, so are bugles, so are fifes or whatever. And that never meant that those instruments were banned across Scotland just because they happened to be on the wrong side, wrong, again, quote, inverted commas, wrong, like whatever side happened to be on the losing side of the Battle of Culloden. None of these instruments were banned as instruments of war, although they were played. Again, it's all just down to just being caught. Like being caught basically red handed in an open act of rebellion with anything in your hand can be an instrument of war. Going back to the old scissors trick, right? So to apply that and to say, yeah, well, he got executed just because he was a bagpiper, so there, and his pipes were considered an instrument of war, so therefore they fell under the Disarmament Act, and then they got banned. That's just wrong. Like you're making connections there that aren't actually even real and relative. I've gone through that with a fine comb. The Disarming Act never mentions anywhere bagpipes or even musical instruments as being weapons. So don't call them a weapon. And if it is indeed even true that the judge or the jury said that they were an instrument of war, well, is it a musical? It's certainly not a weapon. It's a thing. It's a tool. It's a musical instrument, right? As are drums. So drums weren't banned across Scotland, were they? No, and neither were fifes or whistles or bugles or any other sort of thing. You got caught on the wrong side of the law, and that's it. You get punished. Doesn't matter what you're holding. That's the read that I'm getting out of it. So to link it up with the Disarming Act or the Act of Prescription, this was an independent, separate case. And by the way, I'm going to tell you of several pipers who were let go, who were acquitted and released and freed, and they had so-called instruments of war. So let's just take a little look at Piper James Reid and let's see where all this stuff comes from. Let's see what he did first of all. So the common thing was that basically he was executed solely for carrying a set of pipes. He wasn't. He was executed for what he got. He was executed for being a Jacobite. That's what lots of them got executed for. Like so, he was no more different than any of the other Jacobites, other than that he was a piper. And he actually tried to get off for being a piper by saying that he was unarmed at the time. So um, So here's a little bit of interesting information I found out about the Reids. Um, okay, and then it specifically mentions James. So here goes. Um, Reids from Angus and Aberdeenshire joined Lord Ogilvy's Forfarshire Regiment, which joined the Jacobite army at Edinburgh in the autumn of 1745. They took part in the invasion of England, and some remained as part of the ill-fated garrison at Carlisle. The regiment fought at Falkirk and Culloden. Other Reids from Perthshire joined Lord George Murray's Atholl men, who fought throughout the campaign. At the Battle of Culloden, raids stood alongside Atholl men and Lord Ogilvy's regiment. A number of raids were left to... those with the Atholl men took part in the fatal Highland charge and fought in the fierce hand-to-hand fighting with the men of the government left wing. Those in the second line supported them and tried to cover the retreat. A number of raids were left to guard the garrison at Carlisle when the Jacobites returned to Scotland in late December. After heavy bombardment by Cumberland's troops, the garrison surrendered and were taken prisoner. One of the prisoners was James Reid of Angus, a piper in Ogilvy's regiment. He pleaded for mercy, saying that he was just a musician. However, the court ruled that the pipes were, quote, an instrument of war, and Reid was executed in York in November of 1746. In the prisoners of the 45, it records 15 individuals with the surname Reid. It names on James Reid, who was captured on the 30th of December 1745. It was pointed out at his trial at York on the 2nd of October that he was only a piper, but he was found guilty but recommended to mercy. Nevertheless, he was executed. The court ruled that no regiment ever marched without musical instruments such as drums, trumpets, and the like, and that a Highland regiment never marched without a piper. And therefore, his bagpipe in the eye of the law was an instrument of war. He was executed on the 15th of November 1746. So let's get our teeth into this a little bit more, right? Let's look at some of the newspapers from the time and see what it says here. So, this information was given in the Caledonian Mercury from November the 25th, 1746. The following is the extract. On Saturday the 15th, James Reid was executed for high treason at York. He was of the Shire of Angus and a private in Lord Ogilvy's regiment. So there you go. He was executed for high treason. He wasn't executed for being a bagpiper. He was executed for high treason. And he was a private man in Lord Ogilvy's regiment. So he was a private in the regiment. This is from the newspaper of the time, from 1746. So here's another couple of articles as well. There's entries into things that I'm not 100% sure of, because it doesn't tell you exactly where they came from. So here's one. Okay. Reid, James Reid, piper, Ogilvy's, the 30th of the 12th, 45, Carlisle, Lancaster Castle, York. Executed at York, the 15th of the 11th, 46, Angus. Taken at capture of Carlisle. It was pointed out at his trial at York on the 2nd of October that he was only a piper, but he was found guilty, but recommended to mercy. Nevertheless, he was executed. The court ruled that, quote, no regiment ever marched without musical instruments, such as drums, trumpets, and the like, and that a Highland regiment never marched without a piper, and therefore his bagpipe in the eye of the law was an instrument of war. Musical instruments. An instrument of war. It's a musical instrument. It even mentions it there. Musical instruments such as drums, trumpets, and the like. As I say, drums and trumpets weren't banned, and neither was the bagpipe banned. Here's another one. James Reid was then tried, whom the witnesses for the Crown plainly proved to have engaged with the rebels, and to have acted as a piper to a rebel regiment. Well, I mean, that's interesting. Just stop there. I'll just stop. James Reid was then tried, whom the witnesses for the Crown plainly proved to have engaged with the rebels. So he was engaging with the rebels, and to have acted as a piper to a rebel regiment, though it did not appear that he had ever carried any arms, upon which he was recommended to mercy by the jury. The court observed upon this that every person who joined any set of people engaged in an open rebellion, though they did not bear arms, they were guilty of high treason. So this is why he's convicted. Every person who joins any set of people engaged in open rebellion, though they did not bear arms, they were guilty of high treason. That no regiment ever marched without musical instruments, as drums, trumpet, or the like, and that in a Highland regiment there was no moving without a piper, and therefore his bagpipe in the eye of the law was an instrument of war. The jury upon this would have retracted their recommendation, but the court told them it must not now be permitted. Guilty. Then the court adjourned to Saturday. So it's clear that in this set of this definitive set of specific circumstances, he's been convicted of high treason, not that he's a bagpiper. And yes, the bagpipe is the thing that tied him to the rebels, so he's executed as such for that. And in this instance, in the eye of the law, his pipes are an instrument of war, and it mentions other instruments like drums and trumpets. So in this instance, his pipe is an instrument of war because he's caught with the rebels. This says it out straight here. The court observed upon this that every person who joined any set of people engaged in an open rebellion, though they did not bear arms, they were guilty of high treason. That's it. So when the judge pronounced sentence, he said that the Jacobites never go without a bagpipe, therefore they're an instrument of war. This phrase was misinterpreted as Reid was sentenced and hanged for treason and not for having played the pipes. Now, this is a quote from a book from somebody who's far, far more knowledgeable than me. The book is called Traditional Gaelic Bagpipe in 1745 to 1945. And it deals with, in his own words, that the myth that the bagpipe was prescribed under the Disarming Act. He goes on to say that the York judge's remark in 1746 at James Reid's trial that a Highland regiment never marched without a piper, it must be adjusted to read, a Highland company in the service of King George never fought without a piper or pipers. So, you see, it's the same thing. It was okay to play the pipes. There was no out-and-out ban put on the pipes. Like, soldiers in the army of King George played the pipes. Other people who are just totally not connected with battles or fighting or Jacobitism or whatever like that, they were okay still to play their pipes. It was only if you got caught like playing them in the army of Bonnie Prince Charlie. In that instance, then yes, it's considered like it's, because there was always this tradition of playing bagpipes in battles and armies in all sorts of descriptions throughout Scotland and Ireland, fighting for one side or another side. And so to say that the Crown itself banned the bagpipes was just a total lie, because the Crown is still using bagpipers. Here's a good one here, just kind of on that topic. An early instance of piping in a body of Scottish soldiers focuses attention on Argyllshire, although as yet without the preeminent family of the Argyll Campbells. In 1627, a contingent of 200 Scotch bowmen was sent, along with a number of the McKinnon clan, to defend Protestantism in France by order of Charles I. So these were over in France defending Protestantism. They were led by Alexander MacNaughton, and their number included pipers and harpers. So again, there's just completely nothing to say at all that the bagpipes are banned, and in fact they went on being played throughout Scotland. Here's a little article here. The regiment now best known as the Black Watch began in the 17th century as a police force for the Highlands. became the independent companies in around 1729 and was embodied as a regiment in the line in 1739 under the Earl of Crawford, a Gaelic-speaking lowlander and protege of John of Argyll. It is nowhere reported that these independent companies had pipers, but given the aristocratic nature of even the private men in these groups in the 1730s, and given the importance to a chief or chieftain's dignity of having a piper, it almost goes without saying that there were pipers in these regiments. Even after that, about the Duke of York remark, it says here, the York Duke's remark, the York the judge at James Reed, right? His remark in 1746 at James Reed's trial that a Highland regiment never marched without a piper must be adjusted to read, a Highland company in the service of King George never fought without pipers or pipers. There is no reason to believe that this ceased to be true in the old traditional sense throughout the 18th century, when pipers were still intimately associated with their companies. Although pipers are seldom mentioned in America and India, at least in the Highland regiments, this is because they were commonplace rather than the opposite. And this just goes on to prove as well that, that decision wasn't a ban on bagpiping at all. It was specifically, as I keep on saying, in his own specific circumstance and case. And in his particular case, his pipes were an instrument, as in a musical instrument of war, because he was caught with the Jacobites. So therefore, yeah, that's the reason he was killed for treason, not for being a bagpiper. And if that was the case, right, if you kind of just draw this conclusion that bagpipes are instruments of war, therefore they're weapons, and then that goes back to the disarming acts, this is like you're really jumping the gun with this, because how do you explain then all the pipers that were released? All the if they were so-called instruments, like if they were so-called like weapons of war as opposed to instruments, of course they're an instrument of war. They're played in that arena. They're played in battle, but not just in battle. Like, they're played for every occasion, and it's only when you're caught playing them in battle by the opposing side, then it's like treasonous or whatever. So here's a little example of just read this out to you. There are several hundred names of soldiers in Prince Charles there are several hundred names of soldiers of Prince Charles Edward. Some of the pipers listed are as follows. So here's a few pipers, right? John Sinclair, piper in Ogilvy's regiment. So here's another one out of Ogilvy's regiment, right? He was the town piper of Arbroath. He was discharged on the 4th of May 1747. He was discharged. John Ballantyne, piper in Lord George Murray's regiment. He was taken at Carlisle. He was tried in York on the 2nd of October 1746 and acquitted. So he was also taken at Carlisle, and he was tried at York in October of 1746, just like James Reed, but he got acquitted, John Ballantyne. Here's another one. Nicholas Carr, piper in Glen Bucket's regiment, or maybe it's Boucher, old Mrs. Bucket on that TV show. Anyway, Nicholas Carr, piper in Glen Bucket's regiment, acquitted October 1746. Robert Jameson, piper in the Duke of Perth's regiment, captured at Carlisle and transported. Here's another very interesting fella, Alan MacDougall of the Duke of Athol's and Lord Nairn's regiments, served as a blind Highland piper and was taken at Falkirk. He was pardoned in 1747. What a blind man could do in any army had only one reason. He must have been an exceptionally talented and well-known piper. But he was pardoned in 1747. And I think the following few statements really just sum the whole thing up for me. Right, so there's a whole load of pipers that got acquitted or let off, pardoned, right, whatever. Manson, in his book The Highland Bagpipe, states that Charles Edward had 32 pipers playing before his tent at meal times. The relevant papers and decisions about hanging Piper Reid have been checked up in the National Library in Edinburgh and in London, and I've yet to find any government decision to hang rebel pipers. James Reid was not the only piper. He was just the unlucky one, as the rest got off or were transported. It would appear that the decision to hang Reid was made by the court at York in isolation and not under any official directive. There is little record of pipers being harassed, imprisoned, or hanged for playing the pipes after the 45, and we know that Joseph MacDonald compiled his complete theory of the Scots Highland bagpipe in 1760, 14 years after the Troubles. It would be reasonable to assume that piping did not suffer unduly. This sums it up too. Since the bagpipes were never prescribed, it is not surprising that the literate record of civilian pipers in Gaelic Scotland during the period 1746 to 1783 is extensive. Chiefly and gentlemanly patronage of piping was very common in the Highlands. The classical form of piping may lost some of its value as a statement of social status in some parts of Gaelic Scotland, but piping was still widely popular on the whole, and both its primary forms, dance and classical, were being composed, the best sign of living tradition. So the pipes were never banned by law in Scotland or in Ireland. They're never mentioned in the disarming acts. They're never mentioned in the acts of prescription. They're never mentioned in the Dress Act. And in the case of Piper James Reid, he was just an unfortunate man that happened to be executed for treason and for being with the rebel army in possession of his bagpipe. But his crime was not that he was a bagpiper. That's not why he got convicted. And the bagpipes, they were never banned. No law says that they got banned anywhere. Piping continued on. It continued on throughout Scotland. It didn't just continue on in the Crown regiments of the British Army. It continued on throughout Scotland. So just like this says here, the bagpipes were never prescribed. It's not surprising that the literate record of civilian pipers in Gaelic Scotland during the period of 1746 to 1783 is extensive. Piping was still widely popular on the whole, and both its primary forms, dance and classical, were being composed, the best sign of a living tradition. Now, I just thought just read out this last little article. I thought it was kind of gas, and it's related to this. It's the last mention of that, all that stuff I was talking about there. And I mean this with full respect to this man. He seems to be a bit of a character. This is from the Camden New Journal, which is a London newspaper. It says, Dave Brooks, the bagpiper who went to court for the right to play on Hampstead Heath, dies at 72. The kind raconteur went to court to defend right to play. And then there's a photograph of him, and it says, Dave Brooks played on the bandstand 3 times a week. Dave Brooks, who has died after suffering a heart attack aged 72, was known as the Bagpiper of Hampstead Heath. He made headlines in 1996 after arguing in court that Heath managers, the City of London, could not prevent him playing by using a bylaw prohibiting musical instruments on the open space, as his pipes were actually, quote, an instrument of war. He told magistrates how in the 18th century a Scottish piper called James Reid was convicted of treason, though he did not carry anything but his pipes during the 1745 rebellion. Hence, legal precedent ruled that they were not a musical instrument. In response, the court told Mr. Brooks that if this were correct, he could be charged with carrying an offensive weapon, and the penalty would be a prison sentence rather than just a fine. A compromise was struck, and he was told he could play at the Parliament Hill bandstand 3 times a week.